Welcome to Module 3 of the Food Zoomers course. Today we are going to cover peanut zoomer, egg zoomer, and nut zoomer, the three remaining food zoomers in our series. So the peanut zoomer is going to test for the antigens listed here. There's several different families of antigenic proteins found in peanut, some of which are more well studied in the realm of allergy response, not so much sensitivity response. However, we will break down, some of the important ones as we walk through. This is what a typical panel might look like on a peanut zoomer in a reactive individual. Again, you're going to see different types of protein families here depending on how someone reacts to these potential antigens. Some of the notable associations you might want to know as far as the antigens found in peanut, there are major antigens and minor antigens. The major ones are the ones that have been well studied as far as it pertains to allergic response. However, some are also associated with sensitivity. So there's going to be the ARA-H family, the ARA-H 1s and 2s and 6s particularly do have some antigenicity as far as it goes to allergic responses, particularly RH2 is the one that most peanut allergic individuals carry IgE antibodies to. When it comes to IgG and IgA, it's less clear as far as its role in sensitivity. For instance, if somebody with an IgG or IgA antibody to RH2 would be more sensitive as far as more severe reactions than somebody with other antibodies to other antigens within peanut. Some of these are going to have homology to soybean and tree nuts. So in the case of ARA-H3, something that you might want to examine would be whether or not the individual in question is also sensitive to soy or nuts. And you can run, those on a soy zoomer or a nut zoomer if you haven't run them, together as a bundle. The minor antigens, some of these are going to have cross-reactivity with pollen and other nuts, seeds, or foods. And so keep in mind that when a protein has cross-reactivity with another protein, exposure to one or both can elicit the same symptoms. So for instance, if an individual has antibodies to ARA-H5 and they eliminate peanuts from their diet, but they are exposed to birch pollen perhaps during spring or fall, they may experience the same symptoms as if they were consuming peanuts simply because they're reacting to a protein that has cross-reactivity with birch pollen. So elimination of both of these things would be necessary in order to diminish the symptoms being experienced. An easier way to look at it would be with sesame and hazelnuts. So for instance, ARA-H10 or ARA-H11, and a peanut sensitive individual that has these antibodies would also want to probably avoid sesame and hazelnut as well in order to avoid whatever symptoms are being caused by the antibody-based sensitivity. Questions often arise whether or not this is an allergy test. Again, back in Module 1, we discussed the differences between allergies, sensitivities, and intolerances. If you suspect peanut allergy, and this would be a situation where perhaps you have an individual who you suspect peanut allergy or peanut sensitivity, but you've run a peanut zoomer, which includes just peanut IgE, which is the whole protein or extract level. It's not going to be peptide-based component testing. If that comes back negative, as well as a peanut zoomer does not show reactivity, but the individual still experiences symptoms when consuming peanuts or foods that have peanut in them, consider a peanut component test, because this is actually going to look at the IgE reactivity of that patient, whereas the peanut zoomer is looking at only IgG and IgA as far as the individual proteins and peptides, and then IgE for the whole protein. If you remember again in Module 1 where we walked through the differences between whole protein testing and peptide testing, IgE antibodies to whole peanut would be completely different than individual antibodies to the proteins within whole peanut, which are what people are actually allergic to. So peanut component would be a nice complementary test in individuals suspected of having strong reaction to peanut. Now, as far as results, there's some things to consider here: when to rotate, when to eliminate. Always there's going to be an initial elimination phase of 30 to 60 days. So regardless of whether you have IgG or IgA antibodies and whether they're moderate or positive, you're always going to want to initially eliminate the food for long enough for the immune system to stop being provoked by it, to calm down, for the intestinal barrier to have a chance to heal through whatever protocols you're using. But then after that initial elimination phase, you may want to consider rotating the food as long as there's no other comorbidities or risk factors for that patient. So if you have moderate IgG or moderate IgA, you've done your initial 30 to 60 day elimination of the food, you've retested the intestinal barrier to confirm that you no longer have antibodies, so there's no zonulin elevated, no antizonulin, antiactin, or anti-LPS, and the patient does not have a history of allergy to peanuts, because keep in mind, again, the peanut zoomer is not going to tell you if the patient is peanut allergic. It's only going to detect sensitivity. In the individual, definitely, but then also if there are peanut allergies in the immediate family, so parents, siblings, or children, or if the individual has a history of eczema or hives, particularly in and around the times they consume peanuts, again, consider running a peanut component and probably not reintroducing peanuts in that patient until you've confirmed the full spectrum of possible reactions in that patient is not coming from peanuts. Eliminating them would be positive IgG or positive IgA. This means longer term elimination for years potentially, depending on the person. And this would also, you'd want to eliminate if someone has a strong family history of peanut allergy or the presence of skin conditions such as eczema or hives after consuming peanuts. Those would be situations in which you would definitely want to have that person eliminate that food. Egg zoomer, so we have the egg white and the egg yolk. Depending on which proteins we're looking for, these are going to be divided by yolk and white antigens. Some things to keep in mind about the egg zoomer: these are commonly asked questions that the lab gets often. The egg zoomer is specific only to hen's eggs. It doesn't detect, or well, we can't say that sensitivity to any of the proteins being tested here rules out sensitivity to duck eggs or quail eggs, for instance. Proteins in hen's eggs may be structurally similar enough to ducks and other fowl that those proteins could still be reactive when consuming those other eggs. So we really can't say for sure. As we discussed in Module 1, we talked about dairy because there's the question of, what if I'm sensitive to cow milk? Does that mean I'm also sensitive to goat milk? What if my patient says they feel okay when they drink goat milk? Oral challenges are cautioned simply because it can be difficult for a patient to associate symptoms that are happening hours or days after consuming a food, especially when they may not be paying as close attention to all of the ingredients in everything that they're consuming. And eggs are certainly one of those ingredients that are ubiquitous, much like wheat and corn and dairy. They show up in a lot of things and they aren't always obvious as far as being an ingredient. So for a patient to be able to determine if something they've eaten is okay or not okay is oftentimes kind of hard for them to determine. So for that reason, an oral challenge of maybe I can try duck eggs might work and it might not work. It would be a situation where you'd want to use your best clinical judgment. Also, something to keep in mind, it is impossible to 100% separate the yolks and whites of eggs. Even when you purchase liquid egg whites in the carton at the store, there are still residual yolk proteins in that. And similarly, when using a yolk separator, for instance, if you're baking and you're separating the whites from the yolks, there's always still residual egg white protein on those yolks. For that reason, Reactivity to only proteins in egg whites or only proteins in egg yolks does not necessarily mean it is safe for that person to eat the non-reactive portion, meaning that if I have antibodies to only proteins in egg white, eating egg yolk, while theoretically might be okay because I don't react to egg yolk proteins, I will never be able to only eat egg yolk because there's no way to remove 100% of the egg white. So for that reason, clinical nutritional counseling should take that into consideration when giving the patient guidance on eggs. So again, here is what an egg zoomer panel might look like as far as what's being reacted to. And just some notable associations to keep in mind. When it comes to egg proteins, there's been some pretty considerable study done on the stability of these proteins, and this can make a big difference for a patient as far as would it be okay to eat eggs or not. When you see antibodies to some of these proteins, if they are heat or acid stable, it means that they do not break down. They retain their structural chemical conformation in high heat and low pH situations, meaning during cooking and in the stomach, the GI tract during digestion. So these proteins will remain intact and will remain antigenic despite being cooked or baked into foods, and also despite hydrochloric acid conditions in the stomach. So if a patient is only sensitive to the non-heat stable, so for instance, if the only antibody this patient had was to ovalbumin, which is not heat stable, it might be safe for that patient to consume products that had cooked eggs in them, for instance, a cake or a cookie, because the egg is cooked. If they had antibodies to ovomucoid as well as ovalbumin, they shouldn't consume eggs because ovomucoid proteins do not break down during cooking or digestion. And therefore, even though the ovalbumin would be broken down, the ovomucoid would not. So the guidance would be not to consume eggs. So the important point is on the test results, if you're looking at the full version of the report, each of the markers has test comments displayed that describe whether or not the proteins are heat stable, pH stable, or enzymatic digestion stable. So those are the three things that can denature proteins and render them inert in the human body. And there are notes on there as far as which ones are stable in which conditions. And that can help you give the best guidance as far as whether or not these foods with these particular proteins would be acceptable. So heat stable wouldn't be acceptable. They would need to completely eliminate eggs. Acid labile, so if you look at GAL-D6, so the YGP42 near the bottom of the chart there, it's heat stable but acid labile, meaning that it's not going to break down during cooking, but in stomach acid it would. So if you have a patient with known hypochlorhydria, this could be a concern simply because that patient may not have enough stomach acid or the pH may not be low enough to break down that protein. Again, if there's any of the other proteins that are heat and acid stable presence that the patient has antibodies to, then whether or not acid labile is irrelevant at that point. So to keep in mind, there are some proteins in an egg that are going to have some cross-reactivity as well as sensitization. Alpha-livetin is one of those. So, the egg and chicken, typically a patient, if they have antibodies to egg, will not also have antibodies to chicken. We're talking about different types of proteins, but there are at least one that research has found that there may be some crossover, that if someone is sensitive to alpha-livetin in eggs, they may also not be able to consume chicken without generating those antibodies. A similar pattern here as far as rotation and elimination. Use the same type of judgment as far as it goes with initial elimination of the food if there's antibodies present for 30 to 60 days. If they just had moderate IgG or IgA antibodies, after you retest the intestinal permeability and confirm that it is healed, introduction of that food could happen as long as that person has no history of allergy to eggs, in themselves or in their immediate family. Those would just be greater risk factors, as well as no history of eczema or hives, especially when consuming eggs. And then similarly, elimination of eggs would happen if they have positive IgG or IgA, and also if they have a strong family history of egg allergy coupled with antibodies to egg on the egg zoomer, or the presence of skin conditions such as eczema or hives after consuming eggs. There is also an egg component, so just like peanut component, where we're looking at the peptide components of these and their antigenicity as far as allergenic response goes. Ovomucoid and ovalbumin are the two proteins in egg that have been identified as major antigens for allergy response. If you have run an egg zoomer on a patient that is suspected of having egg sensitivity and it's not very reactive, but the patient has somewhat severe reactions to eggs, or especially if there's also egg allergies in the family, consider running an egg component test just to detect and find out if potentially you're looking at IgE reactions, which of course are not going to show up on an egg zoomer. So then next we have the nut zoomer. This is a pretty, all-encompassing test as far as more of the common nuts being consumed. Of course, we have a separate zoomer for peanuts, which are not true nuts. They're more in the legume family. So these are some of the more common nuts being consumed, and then the proteins within them. So here we have, a result of what you might see come up on a nut zoomer, and some associations to be aware of. So again, with some of these, very similar to the way proteins in eggs can be stable in heat, low pH, as well as enzymatic hydrolysis, you may see those same types of situations with these nuts. Almonds are heat labile, which means they break down in high heat conditions. Many different nuts have cross-reactivity or homology to certain other nuts, seeds, and fruits. And so when you have antibodies to that protein, so we'll use PRU-D1, for example, it's highly analogous to pear, apple, sweet cherry, and apricot. So when eating almonds and a particular symptom is produced, that same symptom may be produced when eating pear, apple, sweet cherry, and apricots if this is the antibody involved in that particular inflammatory symptom. So just things to know. And again, this information is all in the comments on the report. If you're reading the full version of the report, it can give you this information. There's also the resistant to proteases. So when looking through those comments on the report, the thing that you want to pay attention to is whether or not baking would reduce the antigenicity. So heat, like roasting, possibly not baking as far as nuts go. Mostly you're just going to see those roasted or boiled as far as a cooking method using heat. But pH, so breaking down in the stomach, and then enzymatic hydrolysis, which just would mean digestion through protease activity. Most of these are going to have resistance to some or all of those conditions, and therefore typically that means full elimination of that food, even if it's cooked. Similarly, cashews and walnuts, you're going to see the same information. We don't necessarily need to walk through every single one of these. That information, again, is on the report. This is more just a quick summary of each one of those. And then, so again, with some of these, there's going to be additional cross-reactivity, especially Brazil nuts appear to have significant homology to a number of different foods, including many other seeds and beans. So it's just important to know when someone is sensitive to Brazil nuts with these particular two proteins, there's potentially other cross-reactive foods you'd want to look at as far as sensitivities that drive symptoms. And rotation and elimination would happen exactly the same way. Rotation and elimination would happen with the same type of pattern. So after that initial elimination of 30 to 60 days for moderate antibodies, confirm the intestinal barrier is healed. And then if the individual doesn't have a history of allergy to nuts or peanuts, since there is, some good deal of cross-reactivity between nuts and peanuts, but there's also the cross-contamination in manufacturing that, you know, if you're allergic to peanuts, typically you can't eat other nuts just because there's so much cross contamination that happens in the manufacturing facilities. So you would just want to keep that in mind. If there's no allergy to nuts or peanuts in that person or their immediate family, there's also no history of eczema, hives, anaphylaxis when consuming nuts or peanuts, it would be safe to potentially reintroduce that food at some point. Elimination would happen if they've got positive IgG, IgA, so this is longer term elimination, remember. And then especially if there's a strong family history of nut or peanut allergy, presence of skin conditions such as eczema or hives after consuming nuts or peanuts. And that is the end of the Food Zoomers course. At this point, go ahead and access the quizzes, complete those. If you have any questions at all, you can reach out to us at our physician services support team there. If you need to schedule a consult with our clinical support team or order materials regarding any of the tests.